Hey everybody, welcome back to Coach All Rights. In today's video, we're going to be going over some tips for the 2025 AP Lang exam. Before we get started, let's be sure to stay in touch. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel and turn those notifications on. Also, be sure to check out the description box below for links to helpful videos. One question that students often ask is, how is the test scored? And the reason why students want to know this is because they're trying to shoot for a particular score. So let's talk about composites. Students will receive a composite score between a 1 and a 5. Students will receive their scores in July. Typically, a 3 is considered a qualifying score. The College Board doesn't like to use the term passing the test, even though that is how I've heard most students refer to it. Please keep in mind that each college or university determines which scores they will accept for credit. So check the requirements for the schools that you're interested in applying to. While many schools will accept a 3 on the AP Lang exam for College English 1 or Comp 1, whatever it's called at that school, some of the more prestigious colleges require a 4 or even a 5. You are allowed to send one free score report, but the signups for this end before you actually receive your scores. Typically, the deadline for the free score report is in June. The AP Lang exam has two parts, the multiple choice section and the FRQs. That stands for free response question. I just call them the essays. The multiple choice section is worth 45% of your composite. The essays are worth 55% of your composite score. Since there are 45 multiple choice questions and the multiple choice section is worth 45% of your score, each question is worth 1 point regardless of the difficulty level or question type. That means that the easiest question on the test and the hardest question on the test are both worth 1 point. Keep this in mind on test day because you don't want to get bogged down with one really challenging question and waste too much time on it. Now, as far as the essays, each essay will be scored by an AP reader who's been trained for that specific prompt. The essays are scored on a 6-point rubric. This means that the person who scores your synthesis essay has been trained for that specific synthesis prompt. A different person will look at your rhetorical analysis essay and they've been trained for that specific rhetorical analysis prompt. And then the same thing for argument. So at least 3 separate people will be scoring your essay. Let's talk about how the points themselves actually work. We said that each multiple choice question is worth 1 point. So this means that if a student answers 28 questions out of 45 correctly, then they're going to get 28 points. The essays are a little bit different though. Because there's a 6-point rubric and there are 3 essays that account for 55% of the composite, you need to multiply the score. The number I use with my students in class is 3.0566. So what I have my students do is I have them take the scores for each of their 3 essays and add those together. So for the sake of this example, let's just say that the student has earned 4 points out of a total of 6 for each of their 3 essays. So if they have 3 essays that they earned a 4 on, they've earned 12 points out of a possible 18. So we're going to take that 12 and multiply it by 3.0566. That's going to give us 36.67. We're going to round this to 37 points. So that means that the student has earned 28 points plus 37 points. So they've earned 65 points total. Now, what does this mean for a composite score? Here is a sample of what the cut scores could look like. Please know that these are an estimate and that these numbers could change depending on the year or the version of the test. Now, if you've seen some of my other videos, you might notice that these numbers look a little higher than those previous videos. That's because last year, in my opinion, the cut scores seemed a little bit higher than what we had been expecting. So going into the 2025 exam, for my own students at least, I'm choosing to use these higher cut scores. So with the previous numbers, our student in question earned 65 points. That means that the student likely will earn a 3 on the exam. They're at the upper end of that 3 composite. Now, this could be very helpful for the student to know because if they earn just 4 more points, then in theory, they can move up to a 4 possibly. Remember that these numbers are not necessarily exact. So how can the student earn those 4 points? Well, there's different scenarios, but they could answer 4 more multiple choice questions correctly. If that's the goal, I would encourage the student to look at ones that they answered incorrectly and try to learn from their mistakes. Also, if they could get 1 more point on one of their essays, so let's say they get a 5 out of 6 on one of their essays, that would be essentially another 3 points. So then they would need just 1 point on one of the essays plus 1 more multiple choice question. In my opinion, that's pretty doable. So in general, for my students, I encourage them to aim for approximately 60% on their MCQ and a 4 out of 6 on their essays. That is the general goal for my students who are trying to earn a 3. Now, for my students that are trying to earn a 4 or a 5, in some sense, it feels like there are more variables with that. So we essentially plug in the numbers like we did with the sample question. We look at their multiple choice and their essay scores, and we try to figure out where they can gain those extra points, or perhaps where they already are gaining those extra points. I know a lot of teachers do a mock exam, but if you're a student who's watching this video and your school does not offer a mock exam and you want to try one on your own, I would recommend using scores from a timed cold read. That means that you wrote the essay during the time constraints of the exam. So approximately 55 minutes for a synthesis essay and 40 minutes for rhetorical analysis or argument. Also, when I say a cold read essay, what I mean by that is that you have not seen the prompt before you actually started writing. The reason why I think this is important for a mock exam is because it closely simulates what you experience on test day. For an accurate mock exam, try to simulate the test as much as you can. This would also mean doing a timed full-length MCQ practice test, meaning that you answer the 45 questions in 1 hour. Now let's break down each portion of the test to talk about some tips to help you improve your score. We're going to start with the multiple choice. For the multiple choice, there are 5 total passages. The first 2 passages are going to be reading comprehension. You're going to receive a nonfiction passage, and there will be approximately 10 to 13 corresponding questions. Passages 3, 4, and 5 are going to be the writing MCQ. So they're still multiple choice, but these are shorter passages, and they're going to say essentially that the passage is a draft at the top. These passages contain 5 to 8 questions, and the questions themselves are about editing. So things like adding and deleting sentences, using the right transition word, things like that. A lot of my students tend to prefer the writing MCQ, which brings me to one of my tips. You want to play to your strengths. So it's important to realize that you do not have to answer the MCQ questions in order. You can skip around within the multiple choice section. And in some cases, that has actually greatly benefited my students. So for my students who tend to do noticeably better with the writing MCQ, remember those are passages 3, 4, and 5. But they also sometimes struggle with pacing, meaning that if they start at question 1 and work through 45, they might be rushing those last couple passages. So what we had them do is the next time they took a practice test, they started with passage 3. They started with the writing questions, took the time they needed to answer the questions correctly for the questions that they were better at, and then they went back to the reading passages and answered those questions. And we noticed that in almost every single instance, the student's score went up by about 5 points. Now, granted, that is anecdotal evidence, but if you are the type of student who notices that you do a lot better with the writing MCQ, but you feel like you have to rush it because it's the end of the section, you might consider starting with those questions as well. I will say this though, most of my students start with question 1 and go to question 45. They don't skip around. But for some of my students, it really has helped them be a little bit more strategic. Like I said, if they noticed a stark contrast between their writing MCQ and their reading MCQ. It's important that you answer all questions, even if you have to guess. You do not want to leave anything blank because you are rewarded points for getting the answer right. It's not like they're taking away points if you get it wrong. So even if you just have a complete guess, you have a 25% chance of getting it right. And that's because starting in 2025, there are now going to be 4 multiple choice answers instead of 5. It's also important to remember that a difficult passage can have easy questions and an easy passage can have difficult questions. My students have corroborated this in the past. There have been times where they said the passage itself was hard, but the questions were easy. And if they didn't realize this, they might have been a little bit intimidated to read the passage. So I think that's important. Don't discount the passage just because it's difficult. It doesn't mean that the questions are going to be hard as well. My next tip is to go back to the passage. This is honestly one of my number one tips, not just for the AP Lang exam, but also for the SAT and the ACT. Don't try to answer based on memory. The answer choices are often very similar. And so it's really important that you go back to the passage and confirm what it has said. When asked about specific words or lines, make sure that you read the surrounding lines for context clues. One of the things that I like about the digital exam is that they highlight the section that they're talking about. And from what I've heard from students who took the exam digitally, they said this was helpful. That being said, I do think it's important to realize that we need to look at the context because sometimes there's a clue that's not in the lines in question. So if the question asks about lines 52 to 53, and let's say that's the middle of a paragraph, you should read that whole paragraph, not just those specific lines. Because if you only read those specific lines, you're probably missing an important context clue. Now, I'm sure as students, you've probably heard this tip before, but you want to use the process of elimination. Even if you can eliminate two answer choices, you are increasing your odds of answering it correctly. So use the process of elimination to get rid of answers that are obviously wrong. Now, a lot of students will tell me, okay, but then I get it narrowed down to two, and I'm not sure which one to pick, and I tend to pick the wrong one. Don't worry, I've got tips for that as well. So there are some answer traps, if you will. So it's important to read carefully. One thing to remember is that half right is still wrong. So what I mean by this is there are times when the answer choice is partially true, but the entirety of the answer choice is not true. A lot of times students will see these answer choices that are partially true and they'll latch on to the part that is true and they'll think, oh, maybe I just misunderstood the passage because I know that this part is right. And so then they'll convince themselves that the part that's wrong is actually right. Don't do that. Know that they sometimes have an answer choice that is half right. Don't fall for that. If it's half right, it's still wrong. There's also times when the answer choice is true, but it doesn't actually answer the question. So let's say that the question is about paragraph 5, and one of the answer choices is true. It did happen in the passage, but it happened in, let's say, paragraph 2. Well, in that case, the answer choice is true of the passage, but it's not actually answering the question. But there are times when students want to pick that because they remember, oh yeah, it said that in the passage. That's why it helps to go back and double check your answers by rereading the passage. Go back to the passage to make sure that you are answering accurately. It's also important to realize that a single word can make the answer wrong. So this is kind of like the half right is still wrong, but there are times when a single word makes the whole answer choice wrong. So you want to read carefully because I have found that sometimes when students are reading quickly, they miss the word that's changing the meaning of the answer choice. Another tip is don't linger on challenging questions. It's okay to guess, flag it, and move on. And the reason why is this is a pacing issue. Remember that each question is worth 1 point. So these really challenging questions are worth the same amount of points as those easy questions. If you linger too long on a challenging question, you could be shortchanging yourself time to answer other questions that you're actually going to be more accurate with. So because it's a digital test, you can flag it and move on. I do think you should guess though, just in case you don't have time to go back to it. So click something, but flag it so that you can go back to it if time permits. Now let's talk about some tips for the FRQ section. These tips I'm going to start with are general, but I will go into each of the specific essays. Personally, I advocate for students writing their weakest essay last. Here's my reasoning. It is relatively easy to score at least a 1-2-0 or a 3 out of 6. And I don't mean that to insult anyone who has earned that score by saying, oh, it's easy to get that score. That being said, I have found that my students can write a 1-2-0 relatively quickly. So let's think of this scenario. If you're going to have to rush any of your essays, it would be better to rush one of your weaker essays as opposed to one of your stronger ones. Because so often I've had students tell me, oh, if I just had 5 more minutes on this essay, I could have done this, this, and this, and it would have improved my score. You don't want to have to rush your strong essay. So what does this look like on exam day? It kind of depends. For some of my students, they know that one of the essay types is automatically their weakest. Like they just struggle with it. Whether it's rhetorical analysis or argument, they just kind of all year feel like they don't jive with one of the essays. And that's okay. So for some students, they can walk into the test and be like, yep, I'm going to do, let's say, question 3 last because argument's my weakest. Now, I have other students who are kind of equally good at all the essays, but they don't necessarily jive with certain prompts. So for these students, what they do is on test day, they look at each of the 3 prompts. They figure out what they're being asked to write about. And then based on that, they figure out, okay, I'm going to do this one first, second, and third. So the one that they like the least becomes their weakest essay, and they put that one last. This strategy has worked well for my students, so it's something that you might choose to consider. It's going to be important that you use your scratch paper to plan. I know that some students think that planning or outlining their essay is taking up too much time, but I've seen so many times where students get halfway through an essay and they realize that they want to change their argument or that they don't know what to say next. And I honestly think if they had planned a little bit more, that they could have avoided that. I believe you get 3 pieces of scratch paper. You can also take notes and potentially like type notes on the digital platform itself. But for some students, the scratch paper is just simply easier. But please take a minute to plan out your essays before you write them. Last year after the test, I asked students some of their best tips for the digital exam because last year in 2024, not everyone took the digital test. This year, though, in 2025, it'll be digital. So those students said that one of the things that helped them the most was knowing some of those keyboard shortcuts. They said it's important to remember that you can't copy and paste the sources, but you can copy and paste the words that you've typed. It's also important to know the rubric. So know the rubric for each of the FRQs. Think of the rubric as the rules of the game, if you will. You want to know what the reader is looking for, and we want to think of it as earning points, not taking away points. So you're trying to earn as many points as possible. In general, commentary tends to be the most challenging part of any of the 3 essays. So one quick tip for commentary is to keep asking why. The word because can be really helpful. Also, synonyms of shows. So illustrates, highlights, suggests, underscores. Those can be helpful. As a teacher and a reader, if I see words like because and then any of the synonyms for shows, I at least know, okay, the student is trying for commentary here. And in most cases, that means we're looking at least a 120. So just something to think about. Again, this is why you need to know your rubric. I tell my students to focus on quality body paragraphs. So in my classroom, we worry about quality, not quantity. Most of my students write 2 body paragraphs instead of 3, and they score just fine. However, I know there are some teachers out there who require 3 body paragraphs. So for classroom purposes, please do what your teacher recommends. And on test day, I personally would advocate for you doing what works best for you for that prompt under those time constraints. If applicable, try for the sophistication point. So last year, I was working with a tutoring student and we went over how to earn the sophistication point. And then each week after that, when she'd write an essay and we'd review it, I would try to guess which bullet point of the sophistication point she was going for. And more often than not, I would know very quickly which one she was going for. And honestly, I think it kind of helped not only that student's writing, but as a teacher, I felt more comfortable awarding the sophistication point. I'm not saying she earned it every time, but she did earn it quite often. And this is also a strategy that I've worked on with my own students. Right now in class, at the time I'm filming this, we're working on argument essays. And one of the ways that you can earn the sophistication point in an argument essay is to have a vivid and persuasive style. And this includes making rhetorical choices. So we've been focusing on how to write about personal experience in a very detailed way. Now, again, this is anecdotal evidence, but as a teacher, I've noticed when I can tell my students are trying to implement these techniques, I tend to give out more sophistication points. So just something to consider. So for those of you that are working toward earning the sophistication point, if that is in your scope of goals, my advice would be to know the rubric and to know how you can earn it, and then be very clear about your attempts to try it. So whether it's the vivid style or broader context, lean into that. And even if you don't earn the sophistication point, typically the essay is stronger because you're trying those techniques. Now let's talk about the synthesis essay. So this is going to be question 1 on the exam, and it is the most time-consuming of the essays. For the synthesis essay, you are given 6 to 8 sources. In recent years, it's been 6 sources, and at least one of these sources is a visual text. So this means that it could be a chart, a graph, a cartoon, a photograph. In most cases, there have been 2 visual texts, and at least one of them has been something quantitative like a chart or a table. So when you see your synthesis prompt on test day, the first step is to identify the topic. What are you being asked to write about? It could be a topic that you're readily familiar with. So in the past, they've had prompts about libraries and STEM and cursive writing, or it could be a topic that you might not have ever really considered before. For my students, they had a prompt about vertical farming, and that was not something that most of them knew anything about. If it's a topic that you are not familiar with, don't panic. There will be enough information in the sources for you to be able to write the essay successfully. In the prompt itself, they're going to give you the different perspectives on the issue. So basically, some people think this or argue this. Others think this. Take a second to ask yourself, hey, do I know anything about this topic? This could potentially help you bring in some broader context later. Regardless of whether or not you know the topic, you want to ask yourself, why is this topic worth discussing? This question was helpful for some of my students a few years ago. I forgot which prompt we were working with, but I remember them saying that the topic itself was kind of boring and not something they cared about. And admittedly, I remember agreeing with them in that moment. However, I framed it differently for them. I said, you know what? It might not be super relevant to us, but it's relevant to somebody. So the question is, who are the stakeholders of this issue and why do they care? So if the topic is something that you're not familiar with or maybe not very interested in, remember that somebody cares about this issue. So it might help to ask yourself, okay, why is the College Board asking me to write about this? My students that year said that asking themselves that question really did help. Keep in mind that there's a couple different prompt types for this. So it's still a synthesis question regardless, but some prompts are going to ask you about the role or value of a topic, whereas other prompts are going to ask you to identify factors. I do have a couple videos specifically about factor synthesis prompts. So if you have questions about that, definitely check out those videos. As you're approaching the synthesis sources, please read the provided information for each source. A lot of students skip the provided information, and I don't think they realize how potentially helpful it could be. So there's going to be a box that has, I believe, an MLA citation. And then there's going to be a sentence that is italicized, and that's going to say in rather plain language what the source is. If you look at the citation, it's going to tell you who the author is. It's also going to tell you the title and the publication. So is it an article from Newsweek? Is it a book? Looking at the title especially can be helpful to determine if the source will support your tentative position. Because usually when students read the different perspectives for a synthesis prompt, they tend to side with one or the other. And I do think it can be helpful to ask yourself, what are my feelings on this issue before I read the sources? But there are times when admittedly students might not know how they feel about it, and therefore it would be better to just start reading the sources and deciding, okay, which perspectives do I agree with? Remember that when you're given a citation, it's listed as last name, comma, first name. Last year at the AP reading, I read for one of the synthesis prompts, and I noticed that there were some cases where students were referring to the author of the source by their first name. And we actually don't want to do that. The first time that you refer to the author, you should use their full name. But then after that, you can refer to them by their last name. However, in some cases, the name might be kind of unique. And if you don't realize that it's listed as last name, comma, first name, it might be confusing which name to use. So just remember that if it says last name, comma, first name, and you're trying to refer to them by their full name, you need to flip it. Another tip for you is to not discount long sources. I've had students tell me sometimes that if a source looks really long, they skip it. Yes, reading a longer source can take more time, but sometimes the longer sources actually have really good info. Also, usually one of the first sources is going to be some sort of contextual source that maybe gives you the history of the topic or other background info. So while you might not necessarily cite that source in your essay, it can be helpful, especially if you're unfamiliar with the topic. But just because a source is long doesn't mean that you should skip it. In fact, the long sources, like I said, tend to have really good info. Now, it is okay, in my opinion, to skim or to speed read if you're worried about pacing. I would practice that skill before exam day, though. Also, for what it's worth, in class, I ask my students to read all the sources if I know we're going to be talking about a prompt. However, when we're practicing for the exam, I tell them that if there is a source that they know they are not going to use, Or if there is a source that they genuinely do not understand, I tell them that they can skip it and move on. I want them to use their time effectively. And if there's a source that they're not going to use, it's probably not worth them annotating it. And if there's a source that they don't understand, it's possible that if they keep reading the other sources, they can come back to that source and it might make more sense. So remember that there's sometimes a difference between how we approach it in the classroom versus exam day. On exam day, we might need to be more strategic. But I will actually give my students a prompt and time them for 15 minutes. That way they get used to having to read sources quickly. If this is something that you haven't done in class yet, it might be worth practicing. Also, for what it's worth, a lot of my students try to do that pre-reading and outlining for synthesis in 10 minutes as opposed to 5. And that's simply because they want to use those extra 5 minutes for rhetorical analysis. But again, that's just a matter of preference. As you're reading the synthesis sources, look for relationships between the sources. So as each source enters the conversation, how does it fit? So when you read source B, ask yourself, how does this relate to source A? Does it agree with or disagree with source A? What new information does it add? And then as you read source C, repeat those questions. It can be really helpful to look at the relationships between the sources as you go. Also, depending on the prompt, some of my students like to take notes, not just by annotating the sources, but if it's a factors prompt, they might write down the name of the factor. Like, let's say it's finances. And then as they're reading and they see that source A is about finances, they'll write finances, A, and then maybe source D is also about finances. So they'll write like A, comma, D. And that way they know that those sources are ones that they can go to if they want to talk about finances. That would presumably be something that my students would do on their scratch paper on exam day. It's helpful to look for short quotes as you go. So on the digital exam, you should be able to highlight these short quotes. Remember, you're not going to be able to copy and paste them, as far as I know. As far as what to quote, though, I tend to advocate for my students to select facts, statistics, real world examples, or expert testimony, just because these can be good logical evidence. Think about it this way. If the author of the article is using the facts to make their article more logical, those same facts could make your paper more logical. I also advocate for my students not over highlighting. Some of my students like to color code and they have a different color for different types of evidence and what have you. And that's wonderful. I think students should find a system that works for them. However, I've also seen cases where students have highlighted way too much and then they couldn't find a certain quote that they were looking for. So as the exam approaches, find a strategy that works for you. As you are reading the sources, consider your outside knowledge. So do you have any personal experience or do you have any outside knowledge about this topic that relates to the sources? Now, you yourself are not a source, but this can make for excellent commentary. So a quick example would be for the library prompt, one of the sources was a schedule of a library. Some of my students, when we do that prompt, will talk about classes that they have been to or that they went to as children at our local library. So they're taking the source and they're kind of making a personal connection to it. This can help to situate the issue in a broader context. Before you start writing, you should know your position. So essentially your thesis, like what are you going to argue? And with that, you should know your main ideas. And I believe you should know which sources you're going to use because you need to use at least 3 sources. And so I think it's helpful if students have a little outline. My students tend to write a pretty simple outline. They might write their thesis and then they'll put main idea 1 and they'll put what it is, just like a word or a phrase. And then beneath it, they'll put the sources that they intend to use. That's kind of the bare minimum. Some of my students do more detailed outlines with evidence and commentary notes. So it is kind of customized to the student, but I do require the bare minimum of position, main ideas, and sources because I want to make sure that the students know that they're going to include 3 sources, and then it becomes a checklist because the rubric is really harsh if you don't have 3 sources. It's also important to keep in mind that you don't get extra points for including all the sources. I know that if you take a class like APUSH or another AP history class, they might advocate for including more sources for that discipline. But sometimes for a synthesis essay, if a student tries to include all the sources, it can feel like you're just kind of stuffing them in there. And it can feel like there's a lot more evidence than commentary. In general, most of my students tend to use 4 sources. It can be helpful to use the original source credentials as needed. So instead of saying according to source A, you could say, according to a New York Times article called blah, 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 or according to so-and-so, an expert on, whatever. It's important that you embed your quotes, so don't just drop them in there. And I advocate for a parenthetical citation. As a teacher, I just find this easier to read and to check that students have the right number of sources. Please remember that when it says three sources, that means that it's three different sources. So if you cite source A, source B, and then source A, that's still two sources, source A and source B. So it's not about the number of citations, it's about the number of distinct sources. I have a couple different videos about how to cite things for a synthesis essay, so I'll include links to that in the description below in case you want more examples. As you're writing your synthesis essay, you're going to need commentary. It helps if you think about why you chose the evidence. And as I said before, I like to see strong verbs. So instead of shows, you can do emphasizes, underscores, highlights, illustrates. These verbs work for the other essay types as well. It can also help if you think about the short-term and long-term impact on society. So again, going back to this idea of why is this issue worth talking about? Think about the why and also the so what. Now let's talk about rhetorical analysis. This one is my favorite of the essays. And keep in mind that I do have playlists for each of these essays on my channel. So feel free to check those out. But the rhetorical analysis essay playlist on my channel is pretty robust. So if you have any questions about the tips I'm about to give you, chances are I have a separate video about that. When you approach a rhetorical analysis prompt, you're going to want to identify the rhetorical situation. Certain components of the rhetorical situation are going to be specified. You're going to know who the speaker is. Chances are you might be given some context. Now, depending on what type of text it is, you may or may not be told the audience. So if it's something like a commencement speech, they're going to tell you which college it was at, so you would know the graduates. But if it's something like an excerpt of a nonfiction text, you're going to have to ask yourself, okay, who would likely read this? So think about the title and what the book is about. They will give you plenty of information, so make sure you read the prompt carefully. The prompt is also going to give you the task. You're going to have to analyze how the writer makes rhetorical choices to either convey a message, develop an argument, or achieve a purpose. So zero in on which of the three of those you're being asked to write about: message, argument, or purpose. As you're reading the passage, it can help to annotate for what and why. What rhetorical choices is the writer making, and why are they making those choices? It also helps if you divide the passage into sections chronologically, because this helps you follow the line of reasoning. So what is the speaker doing in the first half versus the second half, or the beginning, middle, and end? A chronological analysis tends to read better as opposed to a device-driven analysis, which tends to jump around. Make sure that your thesis has 2 to 3 clear rhetorical choices, ideally with the specific message, argument, or purpose. If you're looking for tips on thesis statements, I do have separate videos about this. I personally advocate for my students to use rhetorically accurate verbs, as I think doing so strengthens their thesis statements. It's also important to make sure that the claims or the main ideas of your body paragraphs are in chronological order, at least in my opinion, and that they correspond with your thesis. Because every once in a while, I'll come across a student essay where the thesis has the choices in one order, and then in the body paragraphs, it doesn't match that order. You do want it to match up. Whichever choice you write first in your thesis should be body paragraph 1. One of the pitfalls of rhetorical analysis essays is limited commentary. It doesn't mean that there's no commentary present. It just means that the commentary is rather superficial. So some phrases to avoid would be things like paints a picture in the reader's mind or to get his point across. These expressions are rather empty, and we want to be more precise. To help improve your commentary, keep asking why in relation to the rhetorical situation. I have a video on my channel about my favorite rhetorical analysis sentence frames, and these sentence frames can help you improve your commentary. I'll link that video in the description below. One question that I'm often asked about the AP Lang essays in general is, do I need a conclusion? Now, technically the answer is no. It's not part of the rubric. However, if you have time to write one, we encourage you to do so. I would say the body paragraphs are probably the most important, but I do think a good conclusion can truly help your essay. So for rhetorical analysis, oftentimes I see conclusions where students are merely summarizing what they've already written. They're basically just restating their thesis. Now, if the thesis wasn't defensible in the intro, but they rewrite it in the conclusion paragraph and it's defensible, they can earn the thesis point. It doesn't have to be in the intro. So that might be one benefit of restating your thesis, just not in the exact same words as the intro. That being said, because these essays are rather short, because again, you only have 40 minutes, writing a conclusion that just summarizes your points doesn't always feel effective. So I tell my students to zoom out. And to do that, I have them consider one or both of these questions. It kind of depends on the passage. First, I ask them to consider how the passage is historically relevant. Now, that question might not apply to all passages, or it might not be as obvious for all passages, but look at when the passage was written and think about what issues were going on at the time and how that relates. You could also ask yourself how the message of the passage is relevant today. For more information on this, check out my rhetorical analysis conclusion video where I give some examples. The last essay on the exam is the argument essay. For some students, this one is the most challenging because you have to come up with your own evidence. Argument and synthesis are rather similar. It's just that with a synthesis, you are provided with the evidence that you can use. And for an argument essay, it comes from your knowledge base. Now, I know that can be intimidating, but I do have some techniques to help. First of all, you want to make sure that you understand the topic. So when you're reading the prompt, slow down. Because, for example, the phrasing striving for perfection is not the same as perfection. So you want to make sure that you zero in on the actual topic you're being asked to write about. Sometimes when students are rushing, they misunderstand the prompt, and then by default, it weakens their essay. So as you're reading the prompt, slow down and make sure you know what you're being asked to write about. A lot of my students benefit from what I call the reasons first approach. So what I have them do is I have them identify the issue that they're writing about and essentially ask themselves, why is this issue helpful or harmful? Now, sometimes helpful or harmful might not be the best words depending on the topic, so you can kind of adapt that. The answers that they come up with are sometimes the main ideas of their essay once they've selected their evidence. So, for example, let's say that we're doing the prompt about exploring the unknown. I would ask them, why is it helpful to explore the unknown? And they might tell me it leads to personal growth, it leads to innovation, it leads to other discoveries. And so those would be some reasons. And then as they plan their evidence, they can match their evidence to those reasons. And those reasons would go in their thesis. So you might brainstorm more reasons than you'd actually write about, but it can help you determine your main ideas. To plan evidence, I use the mnemonic chores. There are others out there. There's Rehugo, Chelps, and there's a few others. Honestly, they all kind of mean the same thing. So if your teacher uses a different one, that's totally okay. Chores stands for current events, history, outside knowledge, reading, experience, and science. Outside knowledge is kind of a catch-all category. So it's basically like anything that doesn't fit anywhere else. So outside knowledge can be sports, pop culture, theater, anything like that. Now, on exam day, if my students do chores, I do not expect them to have equal examples for each category. In fact, for some of the categories, they might not have an example at all. This is just to give them a guide to kind of figure out the different possible examples they could do. Now, some of my students like to start with chores instead of starting with the reasons. It just kind of depends. As you're thinking about your evidence, you want to think about specific evidence. So just saying sports is too broad. Gymnastics is somewhat specific, but it would be better to focus on a particular person. So in this case, Simone Biles, and you can actually make that even more specific too. So for instance, are we talking about her getting the twisties and withdrawing from competition? Are we talking about her comeback at the subsequent Olympics? When we say specific evidence, it generally helps if you have proper nouns. So specific people or events. Be mindful that events like the Civil Rights Movement, the American Revolution, World War II, while proper nouns are, are oftentimes still too broad and can be narrowed down further. One fear that I know students have is, what if I can't think of any good examples based on the prompt? So here's a technique that might be helpful. If you're struggling to come up with evidence, ask yourself, what do I know a lot about? Think about topics that you could speak about for a few minutes, even if they're not academic topics. This tip started because I had some students who were self-proclaimed experts on dance moms. And a couple years ago in class, they thought it would be funny if they would write about dance moms for pretty much every prompt that I gave them. And here's the thing, because they knew about dance moms so well, they wrote some really strong paragraphs and they were able to connect dance moms to a variety of different prompts. And I also noticed that as they wrote about dance moms more, their writing got better. So even though it might not be this topic that seems very academic, if you will, they wrote about it articulately and it made for an interesting essay. Since then, I've had other students who have written about their niche topics. So I had a student who was very familiar with Marie Curie. And so I read multiple essays about that. I've had other students who are very familiar with certain historical figures or time periods, and they were really drawing on their evidence and they were really drawing on info from maybe their A-push class. If you're struggling to come up with evidence, think about a topic that you know well and then ask yourself, can I relate this to the prompt somehow? I can't promise that that technique will always work, but I have seen it work really well for students who are struggling with certain prompts. It's also important to remember that when you are introducing your evidence, you need to provide context for the evidence that you choose. Don't assume that the reader knows because readers are not supposed to infer background knowledge or connections. I found that this happens most often when students are writing about someone that they consider to be relatively famous. I've found that this happens most often when students are writing about rather famous events or people. So, for instance, it could be Thomas Edison and the light bulb, or Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus. Students assume that because those are very popular examples that the reader knows what they're talking about. And it's true, the reader might know, but the reader is not supposed to take their knowledge of the topic and project it onto your essay. So you need to give that appropriate background information. Think about why you chose that example in the first place and make sure it's really clear why that evidence fits the prompt. Sometimes it might feel like you're explaining something obvious, but those might be important connections in your line of reasoning. Another question I'm frequently asked is, do I need to address the counter argument? Some teachers make this mandatory in their classrooms. However, it is not a mandatory part of the rubric. It can, however, lead to a nuanced argument. I tell my students to consider whether a concession and refutation or a counterclaim and rebuttal would help their argument and where it would be most effective. So while I don't require my students to put it into their timed essays, it is a skill that we practice in class. And for those timed essays, I ask them to consider, would it truly help their argument? And if so, where should it go? A lot of times students like to put it at the end because that way, if they run out of time, they can just scrap it and they still have the rest of their essay intact. But there might be times where it would make more sense to put it toward the beginning. It just kind of depends. It's important to think about your line of reasoning as well. So as you're planning your essay, think about the order of your main ideas and the order of your evidence. You want to ask yourself, should I pair two related examples together? Or is one example going to be sufficient for the paragraph? It helps to focus on transitions, or some teachers call it linking language, to connect ideas within and between paragraphs. There's one sample essay from the College Board for the Exploring the Unknown prompt that I like to use to demonstrate this. It was one of the essays that was rescored with the 6-point rubric. The student does a great job of connecting their ideas throughout the essay. I'll try to link that one below in case you've never seen it before. But those transitions or linking language, it's really the same thing, can be very helpful to guide your reader throughout your essay. For those that are trying for the sophistication point for style, consider making rhetorical choices. All those choices that you analyze in RA, you can now make when you're writing your argument. One of the most common that I see students trying to do is an anecdote. You are allowed to write about personal experience. And quite frankly, some prompts really do lend themselves to personal experience. But I think there's a way to do it well. I do have a couple videos on this. But if you're writing about personal experience, make sure that you include those relevant details and the lesson or message. You want to make sure it's clear why you're telling that story. But that's exactly what it is. It's a story. So you can employ that narrative style to make it more engaging. A good example of this for the AP Lang exam is one of the essays for that same Exploring the Unknown prompt that I mentioned. The student wrote a 3-paragraph essay that starts with an anecdote about going to a ropes course. I like to use that one as a model for my students because the other essay I mentioned is a very like traditional structure, and the one with the ropes course is maybe a little bit more unique. And I think it's valuable for students to see both. All right, there you have it. Those are some of my best tips to prepare for the AP Lang exam in 2025. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And also make sure that you are subscribed to the channel. That way you don't miss any new content. I'll also be doing some YouTube lives as the exam gets closer. And like I said, I do have playlists of each of the different essays. So if you have questions about what you're learning in class, or if you just want a little bit of outside help as you prepare for the exam, please be sure to check out those videos as well. Thank you so much for watching. Happy writing!